of what's happening here. The last time we left off, I had set up a basic health manager, and this kind of picks up with some of the stuff that was posted in YouTube recently as well. Right now we have this simple setup where we're capturing player health. It's printing to screen. The value of the player health is printing to the center of the screen. And right now there are cubes that contribute to health and subtract from health right now. And so now this is a value that we can kind of control. We can evaluate and determine how that affects our gameplay. So a couple of things that you'll notice, and this is just kind of basic housekeeping, is that right now I'm looking at frame labels. Frame labels are showing up. In your builds, this is a reminder, we don't want to see frame labels. These little debugging labels that are showing up, mine are popping up saying idle. That's telling me which state that specific state machine is in. Those are things that we want to have turned off in every build that we submit, and I would recommend at this point, unless it's providing value to you in your development process, just turn them off as a matter of practice. You can do that by going to the Preferences tab inside Playmaker, and this is where you kind of control the a lot of the aspects of Playmaker, and we want to turn off Show State Labels in Game View. At that point, those state labels won't be there. They won't show up in your build. But if you need to, you can turn them back on. My preference really is to debug this stuff through the Playmaker window. There's some other windows and debuggers that will help us as we get into more complex game development. But right now we have all the information that we need on screen. So I have my health manager. It's printing to this heads-up display, which happens to be centered in the screen, and we'll correct for that a little bit later. So we're printing the player health string. That's kind of where we left off with this basic mechanic. Now, I want to establish my player health at the beginning of the game. And even though my player health, it's a global variable, and I'll just pop open my global variables, I have this player health float, and even though I can open up a string and a value and set its initial value, this is not always bulletproof or foolproof. In this way, my starting health value will start at 50, and we can see that on screen. However, we want to build a system in place. You can see that my health is 50 now. We want to build a system so that when our game starts, we initialize variables. In this case, our health is the most kind of simple thing that we're tracking. And we'll do that with an initialization state. So we'll start to build in an init state in our basic managers, and it'll go something like this. In my health manager, I have an idle state, and I want to end up in the idle state, right? This is where kind of the magic is happening of it getting managed, health being managed. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right-click and add a state, and the convention that I'll use is init, short for initialization. And we want to pass directly through this state and go to our logic, whatever the next step of our logic is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a transition. I'm going to add a finished transition. In other words, what happens is once we encounter this state, we immediately run any logic that is listed here, and then we're going to pass it over to our next state. We want this to be our start state. Okay, we don't want it to start in idle, so I'm just going to right-click on the init state, and I'm going to set this as the start state. Okay, so now that state is the default start state. Okay, now once we start right-clicking on states, there are a couple things that we should start to familiarize ourselves with. We should start to familiarize ourselves with these submenus and options that we're coming into contact with. One that I find useful is setting the color of states and come up with a color code. In this case, like in an initialization state, I'm going to set it to blue just so that I know that all my init states have this color combination so that when I go to a logic, I can see, but you can determine if that's useful for you or not. It's really important, though, to start labeling our states appropriately rather than letting them say state 1, state 2. Okay? So I'm passing through my initialization state. I always like to test this logic just to make, even though it's not doing anything, you can see that it passes right through. And now we're running our health manager, which is doing nothing but printing our current health to screen. The init state, this is the place where we want to establish our starting values for our game. Okay, our player, in my case, might have washed up on shore. Maybe health isn't 100%. Okay, what I want to do is, because I'm using a float for my player health, I could type in float and then just scan through this big long list. But the basic convention is to set a value. So I'll type in set, and you'll notice that there's a math category, and we can find set float value. Okay, it's showing up in math because float is a number, right? And we're basically setting a value. So I'm going to add that action, the set float, on my initialization state. I'm going to go find my health, and I'll set this float value to whatever value I want. I'm not setting to every frame. Okay, and there's two things that I want to put a really fine point on here. This finish state is a custom, it's a system event that's happening, meaning that anytime the logic is run in this state, when it's done running everything in here, pass it over to the next, wherever we have it wired to. So if I hit the play button, you'll see that it just kind of runs right through, and now I have my health set. If I were to create something illogical, like set the float value every frame, and I hit play, I'm constantly setting my health value to 75 because I checked this. It's happening every frame. Therefore, it's never finished. It won't. This logic does not allow it to be finished, and this is something that you could run into with this finished state. So you need to be mindful of that. The only time we use the finished state is if we have a set of actions that don't have a send event associated with them. So there are some actions that have events. In the case of comparing floats, which we looked at a few weeks ago and we'll look at again today, they have conditions that send from one event to another. Based on if a number is greater than or less than, go to a different event. In the case of a finished event, because it's a custom system event, we don't want to use it unless we have a compelling reason. And I have a very compelling reason to use it right now, which is I'll turn off every frame. I just want to set my player health. What this will set us up for later, this will set us up for potentially, this will set us up for when we respawn, when we die, when we hit our death point, we'll pass it back through the initialization state and then pass it over to the logic that manages what our health is. So we'll effectively reset our health. Okay? If we don't do that, if we rely on just the initial float value being set at the variable level, once through our game logic we reduce our health to 0, there's no resetting that unless we restart the level, which would rely on this start state. Okay? Make sense? We all on the same page with that? So we're going to start using these initialization states. Okay? The logic for our health system right now is that we're just printing to screen, but I want to set up a situation where we determine whether or not we're dead, and we'll develop a death state. Okay? And we looked at this a little bit before. We looked at it really quickly. But we did this with, does anybody remember the action that we used to evaluate our player health float to determine whether we were less than or greater than a value? Anybody remember what the keyword was that? Anyone? No one? Thank you. Float compare. Okay, so we'll use a float compare during this idle state. And now it might be an appropriate time to call this idle state something else, but so keep that in mind. We'll follow our own logic here. But I know that my convert float to string, if you remember, this is the thing that converts the current value of our float to screen so that we can print it. This is working beautifully. I know exactly what it is. I don't need to see it because I don't need to debug it, so I'm going to collapse that action. I know it's working the way that I want to. This is printing to screen. That's working the way that I want to, so I'm collapsing those actions so I don't have to evaluate all of that stuff going on visually at this point. But what I want to do is I want to determine if my health is above or below 0, so we'll use this float compare. And that's hiding in the logic section, but again, if we, we can search for this if needed. So I'm looking for a float compare, and I want to evaluate our player health against another value. So we could either do float 1 or float 2 as our variable. It doesn't really matter which, but that will determine the logic down here as to how we're comparing it. So in this case, I'm going to just toggle this little button over here that allows me to go from this hard value that we would key in. I don't want to evaluate two values that are keyed in. I want to evaluate a variable, the current state of this variable, against a value that I type in. And in this case, I think 0 is fine, right? Because I just want to know if our player health is above or equal to, or excuse me, less than or equal to 0. So I'll just satisfy this logic down here. I'm taking player health against float 2, which is 0. I know that my initialization state tells me that I'm starting off with a player health of 50, and then I'm going to set it later to 75 just to see the difference. So I know that my player health is at least 50 and most likely 75 by the time it gets here. I'm going to compare that against 0. If it's equal to 0, I'm going to consider myself dead. Okay, so I'm going to drop down this transition event menu, and I don't have any custom events that I've created. Okay, if I go into I should see them in this list here right next to finished. I don't want a system event, don't want a network event, I want a new event. And this event I'm going to call is dead. Okay, and I get this error, and that's because I'm not using it, and so I'll add the is dead, and I'll wire this over to a dead state. So a state that, if this condition is true, if my player health is at 50, currently comparing against 0, it's not equal to 0, therefore I'm not firing off equal. If it's less than 0, I also want to fire off is dead, because I could see myself in a position where my health is at 10 and I take some damage that's minus 25, therefore my health is negative 15. So it won't be caught by equal alone. I could see a situation if I'm being dynamic about my health, where it might not equal that. So both equal and less than both points to is dead. And I'm going to make sure that is being evaluated every frame. Okay. At this point, I need another state. This is my is dead state. And then I'll wire this over. Okay, so this is kind of the core logic for the death state. Here in the idle state, I'll just call this is alive for now, and this state is dead. I think it kind of makes sense to probably color code this. It'll help me kind of evaluate this a little bit quicker. And so this is testable, right? I can test this. Maybe I can test it. I don't think I have enough stuff on my screen to get my health below that threshold of 0. Okay, I just consumed all the danger on my island, and I don't want to, add to the health. So I'm going to have to duplicate some of these bad cubes, and I'll do that really quickly. Command D to duplicate. If you want to move things, snapping things as you move them, if you hold down the command key, they'll snap in 1 unit increments, which is really useful for moving things. In this case, 1 meter. We'll use this a lot in our next project when we start building up levels from scratch. I'll command D to duplicate, hold down the command key again, and move that. Kind of a variation on this is if you hold down the V key, when you have an object selected, you'll notice that as I roll my mouse around, it's selecting vertices. And you can use the vertices as you move it to snap it to other objects, which can also be very useful if you want to stack things on top of each other, absolutely, without having to figure out what the math is over here. Okay, so in this case, I'm snapping at 1 meter. If I want to modify that I believe it's under edit. Yeah, there's the snap settings there, and you can kind of adjust these snap settings as needed. Okay, so that's what I'm doing. That's why these things are jumping a little bit rather than moving, just sliding around. So here's, I got enough to kill myself in game here. I'm gonna jump into my health manager, and just to make this a little bit easier to debug, I'm gonna set my initial health value to something much lower, like 20. So now when I hit play, I should have health of 20. I can go run over my health system, and now you can see that it triggered the dead state because it evaluated my health and I met the right criteria. I was equal to or less than 0, and therefore I fired off is dead. Okay, I'm ignoring the greater than because I don't want to do anything. I want to stay here. I want to stay alive. But potentially I could build some logic that would pass through and determine whether I should be greater than or less than. Okay. Any questions about any of that stuff?
It's similar, but I'll ask you later on.
Okay.